a part of the crust which must have been brought down to that depth. So, and that occurrence is about 3.2 to 3 billion years old. Third one is the arc magmatic association, which again is characteristic of subduction zones, modern subduction zones. The association is typically bolinite, magnesian andesite, and adacite. I'm not going into the plutonic associations, it's the volcanic ones. Such association of volcanic rocks is found in pretty old greenstone belts. In Pilbara, this is 3.12 billion years. In Ishua greenstone, similar association is found, which is 3.7 billion years. And the oldest one is found in Nuvvuagittuq in Canada. There are two estimates of the age of the Nuvvuagittuq greenstone belt. It's the same samarium neodymium date, but there are two interpretations of it. That is, one group interpret that to imply 3.8 billion years to be the age of crystallization. The other group interpret the samarium neodymium data in terms of crystallization at 4.8 billion years. Very, very old indeed. Fourth one is porphyry copper, which is typical of the Andean type of subduction zone, where the oceanic plate goes down below the continental plate. And the oldest porphyry copper occurrence is 3.3 billion years. Volcanogenic massive sulfide, which is not along the subduction zone, which is typical of the rift zones or the divergent boundaries, and because of the hydrothermal fluids there. And the volcanogenic massive sulfide ores is oldest one is 2.7 million years old. So overall, these all indicate a very old age for the beginning of the plate tectonics. And I have typed in bold letters the last one, the zircon, oldest zircon hafnium date, which gives indeed a very old age, about 4.4 to 4.5, almost near after within 100 million years of the start of what we call the birth of the earth as we know it. I want to develop this point a little bit further because to me it seemed to be a very interesting way of how information is used, how different types of information is used to arrive at really startling conclusions. You know, the oldest zircons are found in Jack Hills in Australia, detrital zircon, and the oldest zircons are 4.3 to 4 billion years old. So the oldest zircon grains, near about 100,000 zircon grains from Jack Hills have been examined by earth scientists from all over the world. And from that, they identified the oldest one, maybe about 100 or so. And what the method is to determine the age at different spots within the zircon. So the different spots give different ages. So the oldest date so far recorded is about 4.3. So what they did is that from the same zircon, from where you get the date, they determine the hafnium isotopic data. And from the determinations, they calculated the hafnium anomaly or EPSA hafnium value. I'm not explaining these terms. These are all known to all of you. So the hafnium anomaly is important because it provides some information of when that zircon is derived from its source, or when the source of the zircon is derived from the mantle. So from the same zircon, some grains showed a positive hafnium value, and some zircons, a few only showed positive values here. These are the 4 or 5 zircons which show positive values. The majority of the zircons show negative values. Positive value of hafnium anomaly implies that the zircon, source of the zircon is derived from the depleted mantle, and that can the age of the depleted mantle from which the source this is derived can be defined by drawing the hafnium growth curve through the plots. So if you draw the best possible line through this, it will intersect the bulk silicate earth at about 4.3 to 4.4. So that's why they think that this is derived from the mantle, depleted mantle, not the term depleted. So the mantle had already been depleted by that time, 4.3 to 4.5 billion, 4.4 billion years old. And the majority of the zircons, which are negative anomalies, imply that they are derived from a continental crust. So if you draw the best possible growth curve through this, then it also intersects in the bulk silicate earth at a point about 4.3 to 4.4 billion years old. And further, so the zircons grew at a time when there is already differentiation between the continental crust and the depleted mantle. And one of the tectonic processes to give rise to such differentiation is plate tectonics. They not only determine the ages and the hafnium thing, they also found out the composition of some inclusions. This is one inclusion is here. This is a quartz albite muscovite inclusion, a typical granitic assemblage. So these inclusions suggest that the garnet zircon grew in a granitic melt. So at that time, the granitic melts were derived from the mantle, which depleted that mantle, and the water must have been present at that particular depth to produce the granite. This is, but there are some criticisms about this. There are some criticisms about this method of this line of argument, is that the determination is made from the same zircon grain, both the hafnium record as well as the uranium lead method record, from which the age is determined, and the hafnium record from which the hafnium anomaly is determined. First, the uranium lead is determined by pointing the laser beam to a very small area. So you get many spots within one single grain. But hafnium is determined after the same zircon has been pitted by the laser to determine the uranium lead. So the hafnium, to determine the hafnium record, we need a larger beam covering a larger area of the zircon. So you can see that all these zircon grains, they are zoned. So it is not very certain whether the uranium lead and the hafnium are recording the same event. So this criticism of this Mark Harrison's argument was made by John Valley, who is also an expert on this zircon hafnium isotopic studies. And there are, in general, there is some serious concerns about this line of arguments, the argument which tries to find out the oldest record of the plate tectonics process. The concerns are, firstly, the quickness of the preservation of the record. You know, the very little, not all of the geological record is preserved. So how can we be sure that what we see in the record is really the oldest and nothing happened before that? So that is one inherent drawback of this method. For example, it has been argued that Glaucophaene schist is not found in very old rocks because the very old rocks expose a deeper section of the crust where Glaucophaene is not stable. So we don't expect old Glaucophaene beyond that particular age. Secondly, the assumption, it's also basic assumption is that the features by which we are trying to identify the plate tectonic process, the features which are formed in a particular setting in the recent past were formed in the same setting in the ancient past, ancient times, when the physicochemical conditions of the earth were different and it was a hotter earth. So whether the same conditions operate along the subduction zones now and subduction zones ends, then is a serious question. And thirdly, this letters is because I did it in a hurry, there is some crave your indulgence for these errors. The subduction-like features may also be triggered by meteorite impact or even by mantle plumes. It need not be plate tectonics. I will develop this point in greater detail afterwards. So, because of this, the individual occurrence of any of the plate tectonic feature, subduction feature, or the spreading feature does not necessarily mean operation of global plate tectonics. They may be local phenomenon triggered either by a meteorite impact or by a mantle plume. The alternative approach to this is to find out what are the consequences of plate tectonics and when these were established globally rather than locally. So that don't look for the isolated occurrence of a particular feature. You look at the total ensemble of features and find out whether there is a global relevance of that feature or whether it is entirely local. Firstly, the crust must have cooled sufficiently to attain a certain rigidity so as to allow lateral motion and subduction of the plates, maintaining their integrity. If the plates did not have a certain amount of strength, they could not maintain their integrity and be subducted or move laterally over their sinosphere. It is estimated that this increased strength of the now, of course, while the modern plate tectonics is working, the plates have that type of rigidity. So it is estimated that it is possible when the upper mantle temperature was not more than 175 to 160 to 175 degrees above the present temperature. Up to that, it has been estimated that the lithosphere and the crust would maintain their rigidity. Beyond that, they would behave as a more ductile material. So there is but this is only an estimate, and there is great scope of research to investigate experimentally and through modeling behavior the upper mantle and properties of the upper mantle and the crust at elevated temperature, and also the likely lithosphere temperature in Hadean and Archean times, both through modeling, through observations of heat flows, and also from geological records. So this is a very great scope of research, particularly for the young scientists here, on this aspect of the plate tectonic question of the age of the plate tectonics. Second point is, this is just a speculative graph. It is only speculative. Just a speculative graph. There are many items which are shown. And this is the beginning of the Earth, about 4.5 billion years. And this is 1 million years later, that's about 3.5. And this is a speculative, look at this curve. This is a speculative surface temperature through this period. And you can see in the very early period, the temperature was so high that there was rock vapor in the atmosphere. This period is the time of the magma ocean, where there's boiling magma on the surface of the Earth. And after that, after this about 10 million years after the birth of the Earth, liquid water started to exist here. And then here it becomes very low. It could even form ice on the surface. But this is speculative. There needs to be more experimental data and more modeling to have a more precise calculated curves. Other geological evidences of rigidity also we can look for. One important evidence of the rigidity of the crust is the presence of regional dike swarms. And most of the important dike swarms, they start at about 2.6 billion years. And secondly, the large sedimentary basins to sustain that weight of the thick sediments, sequence of sediments, the crust also must have certain amount of rigidity so that the very large basins could form. The oldest major sedimentary basin is about 3 billion years old, the Pongola Basin in South Africa. Then granulites also suggest that the crust was strong enough. Why? Because granulites are formed in the lower crust or in the upper mantle region, and the pressure must have been there high, so that the thickness of the crust must have been high. So the granulites also indicate that the crust must have been strong enough to sustain crustal thickening. Old granulite terrains are mostly late Archean, 2.7 to 2.5 billion years. And next is about from the study of the sediments. The greenstone belt sediments, sedimentological study of the greenstone belt sediments, they indicate that the provenance of these sediments was with a very low relief. So low relief means the crustal thickness must have been less. And if the crustal thickness is higher, there will be greater relief and the more continental part will be exposed above the sea level, and there will be increased erosion of the continental material. So increased erosion of the continental material would be reflected in the change in the composition of the seawater. So if we look at the strontium isotopic ratio in the seawater, we see a spike in the strontium isotopic ratio of seawater about 2.9 billion years ago. Part of this data have come from India, from the National Geophysical Research Laboratory. And this reflects that at 2.9 billion years, the relief must have been such that the continents must have emerged and the erosion took place, and presumably the crust must have been thicker, and the thicker crust automatically implies increased continental strain. Next, we can try to look for change in tectonic style. We look at the Pilbara Craton. In the Pilbara Craton, it's a very old Archean terrain. In the Pilbara Craton, there is a East Pilbara terrain, which is about 3.57 to 3.3 billion years old, and they are characterized by the lobe and cusp type of structure, granite domes and keels of greenstone belts. So this type of tectonic style it's reasonable to assume that this type of tectonic style with the dome and the keel type of tectonics is possible when the crust is slightly more ductile. And when the crust is more rigid, then we can get the fold and thrust belt type of tectonics. So if you see the Pilbara Craton, then in the central Pilbara tectonic zone, we see already the appearance of fold thrust belts. And this is a younger craton, which is 3.1 billion years old. So from this is the transition from presumably more ductile style to more rigid style, more brittle type of deformation sequence. Remember that this brittle and ductile, these are all meant in a relative sense, because what I called brittle, there is ductility in this also, otherwise the structures there would not have been preserved in the rock. The neighboring Ilgand Craton also show the same thing. In the western terrains, there is no linear belts, whereas the eastern terrain is marked by the linear belts. And the western terrains are 3.7 to 3.3 billion years old, and the eastern terrains are 2.7 to 2.6 billion years old. And what I mentioned earlier about the dike swamps, there is a spectacular dike swamp here, which cuts across both these terrains, which is about 2.7, which is about 2.4 billion years old. So, and there is also volcanic rocks which have geochemical similarity to modern day arcs, which is about 2.7 to 2.6 billion years. So there is also a transition from 3.7 and 3.33 to younger 2.7, 2.8. That's age range. Another difference in tectonic style, this is asymmetry, strong asymmetry in the destructive margin. In the frontal part of the subduction zones, we get the fold and thrust belts, and the behind part is the more ductile one. Here, the Abitibi Archean in Canada, there is very extensive seismic profiling, which has brought out the subsurface structure of the terrain. Here, the Opatica terrain, you can see a series of stacked thrust slices, and the Abitibi terrain, which shows the subducting plate. So the structural asymmetry, which implies a subduction zone, was already established about 2.6 to 2.8 billion years, which is the age of the Abitibi belt. Now the supercontinents itself. The presence of the supercontinents also indicates that the supercontinents are formed by amalgamation of the continents. So formation of the supercontinents would imply lateral movement of the continents to join together to form the supercontinents. So supercontinents is an indirect evidence of the operation of plate tectonics. The oldest known supercontinent is Superia or Sclavia, which is about between 2.7 to 3 billion years old. There are still older supercontinents have been proposed, like Ur, which is early, very early Archean, but they are not based on very firm footing. So this I am leaving. One other interesting thing you find here, that if you plot all the zircon ages through time, the number of zircon grains which are plotted is about 100,500, nearly 100,500 grains. You can see that they show certain peaks, and these peaks are coinciding with the age of the supercontinents. Now, zircons are formed either through crystallization from a melt or through reworking of the old crust. So these supercontinents either indicates large magmatic activity, large-scale magmatic activity, or large-scale crustal reworking, which indirectly points to operation of plate tectonics. Paired metamorphic belts. Here, all the metamorphic belts are plotted here. You can see there are three categories are plotted here. This is the low pressure category, low pressure fascist series or Bakan type metamorphism. This is the intermediate, this violet one, purple ones. The red ones are the intermediate pressure. The violet ones are the intermediate pressure, the Barrovian type, and the blue ones are the high pressure fascist series. Michael Brown, who produced this diagram, he, instead of calling a high pressure or glaucophil schist fascist, he called it alpine fascist series. So these are the two different fascist series, and in modern subduction zone, we get juxtaposition. The asymmetry is, I already mentioned, reflected by the occurrence of the juxtaposition of high pressure series with, in some places with medium pressure, in some places with low pressure series. If we plot the age of the metamorphic belts in time and plot them in a diagram, then you can see this is the thermal gradient, these thermal gradients against the age. The low thermal gradient is the high pressure series. They don't, most of them are concentrated here. A few are concentrated, go up to this. These are not glaucophil schist. Most the glaucophil schist, I think the oldest occurrence is this one. This is the intermediate fascist series. This is the low pressure fascist series. Both of these go to a very old age. So if you consider age-wise, just as there is bimodality, asymmetry is reflected by that bimodality, just as there is bimodality in the modern subduction zone, there is a bimodality of metamorphic belts also if you plot them in time. So in time there is a bimodality, but what we are not certain is whether there is a bimodality in space also. So unless there is a bimodality in space, the plate tectonic operation cannot be confirmed, cannot be deduced in a very confirmed manner. Then we come to the magmatic association. So magmatic associations, people have tried to find out the typical magmatic, geochemical signatures of arcs or of within plate volcanics or of MORB and tried to match them with the past record. But there is an inherent flaw in this method because it is based on the assumption that the conditions in the modern arc was the same as the conditions obtained in the past. This, I just illustrate this with just only one geochemical signature. Thorium is to ytterbium ratio and niobium is to ytterbium ratio. The red cloud and the blue cloud. This is the red cloud, blue cloud, and this is the red cloud. These red clouds and blue clouds represent the arc and the within plate and MORB of modern Earth. But if you see the Archean plots, the green, I don't know whether you can see it very clearly. The Archean plots you see, the Archean plots, they spread across these two distinctly defined. So obviously, if we depend on this particular signature, in some occurrences, it will look like an arc setting. In other occurrences, it will look like a MORB setting. One explanation of this that there were MORB localities and Archean localities, but there is what it highlights is that prudence should be exercised in applying these individual geochemical signatures to very ancient rocks. What many geologists have, art scientists have suggested, that instead of relying on individual geochemical signatures, we should rely more on the lithological stratigraphic sequence of the different settings and the chemical stratigraphy also. This is illustrated by the Luvu-Agetu greenstone belt, which, as I mentioned here, according to one estimate is 3.8, according to the other estimate 4.8. If you see, this is the lithostratigraphic sequence of Izu-Bonin Mariana Arc in modern Earth. And this is the sequence in Luvu-Agetu's occurrence. You can see that there is a very great correspondence between the stratigraphic sequence of these two, with the modern arc, with the Luvu-Agetu occurrence. Not only that, you see the chemical stratigraphy of these two are also very correspond with one another. These very high spikes are because of the alteration in the modern arcs. You can see that the chemical stratigraphy is also corresponding. So this, people think, or some scientists think, that this is a better way of identifying the early tectonic setting of associations, magmatic associations, than on individual signatures. The same setting is same ratios, similar ratios, the thorium from this same data. Thorium is to ytterbium ratios, again stage, if they are plotted. Here we plotted the two ratios and plotted the Archean age. Here we have plotted the thorium to niobium ratio against the age. And these are the different colors are from the different localities. So you can see that in West Greenland, it is this lower part is the field for the modern within plate sequence, and the blue part is the sequence of the arc, is the ratio of the arc. So you can see in West Greenland, there is the same area. Some are within the MORB type affinity within plate, and some are within about arc type affinity. This is the Luvu-Agetu, and this is the Pilbara. In Pilbara also, you find they straddle the boundary, and then there are definite arc associations here. So one explanation of this will be to think that these areas represent those areas of the Pilbara Craton where an arc situation was obtaining, and these areas were equations are where those locations in the Pilbara Craton which were the spreading centers in the ancient times. I am only showing this, that why I mentioned that individual geochemical ratios, you have to be prudent in using such ratios. This, to me, it seems to be a much more sounder footing. Then next point we consider is the secular change in the composition of the juvenile of the crust and of the new crust. This is the composition, bulk composition, rubidium by strontium ratio of the upper crust, bulk composition of the upper crust. This is given by Condi. You can see at about 3 billion years, there is a jump in the rubidium strontium ratio. This is for the upper crust. The same thing, instead of the upper crust, Reeve et al., they tried to determine the age of the isotopic ratio of the source region from zircon grains to find out the age of the juvenile crust in different ages. So if you see the juvenile crust, the rubidium strontium ratio is naturally much lower. And here you also see the more or less the similar type of jump from at about 2 billion years. Also, it has been seen from the study of about 13,000 samples that this ratio, this rubidium strontium ratio of the juvenile crust, can be used as a proxy of the silica percentage of the crust. So this is the silica percentage corresponding to the different isotopic ratio of the juvenile crust. So you can see that in the very early times, in the Eoarchean to late Archean times, in this period, the crust was of mafic composition, and they progressively became intermediate composition. So there is both a secular change of the total bulk composition of the crust and a change in the new crust that is formed at different times. So it is hypothesized that this might mark the onset of plate tectonics. This region here, about 3 to 2.5, that region, it may mark the onset of plate tectonics. I mentioned earlier about that strontium isotope ratio of the seawater. This is that curve. Here you can see that this curve is like this here, and then it jumps up. So there is a spike in the oceanic strontium isotopic ratio at about 2.9 billion years. So this indicates increased continental relief and implying increased continental thickness. The growth rate of the continental crust is also important in this context. There have been many models of the growth rate of the important crust. You have seen that in most textbooks, how many different models about the growth are there. I have taken only one or two I have taken from that to illustrate the point which I think is important. These are the models which are, most of the models or some of the models were based on the relative proportion of the rocks of different ages in today's Earth. So what is the volume percentage of rocks of 2.5, the volume percentage of rocks of 4.5, and to try to construct a growth rate of the continent from that type of data, modified, of course, by other things. So the point about this type of approach is that this is likely to be biased, because the rate of erosion of the old rocks and the rate of erosion, or not rate, the total erosion of the old rocks and total erosion of the new rocks is not likely to be the same. The Himalayas are not likely to be eroded much, whereas many of the Archean terrains are almost at the continental freeboard. So these models here, they are not dependent on the present volume of the continental material on the modern Earth. These are based on the Zarkon record, which tell about the generation of the new crust, and then different calculations are there to calculate the rate of growth of the continents. So you can see here that again here in 2.9 there is a marked change in the growth of the crust. So this is a faster rate of growth and this is a slower rate of growth. So this coincides with the other the transition from mafic to felsic, which I showed earlier. Now, faster rate of growth and slower rate of growth, one factor which is important is that if we consider the plate tectonic process, a great deal of the growth of the new crust is controlled by the rate at which crust is destroyed at the subduction zone. So greater rate of growth would imply less destruction, and faster growth would imply less destruction. And the rate of new growth or rate of new addition to the continent, this will be controlled primarily by the mantle temperature, which is melted to produce the crust, or which crystallizes to produce the crust. That is smoothly declining or with exponentially declining with time. So there is some ways of calculating the rate of new growth. And we estimate the net growth from these two. And then on that basis, this curve is there. And the same scientists, they also drew a curve showing the net growth rate, the computed destruction rate, and the generation rate computed from the mantle temperature evolution. So you can see that within this region, there is a sudden increase. This is the net growth rate, the blue curve, and the green curve is the net growth of the new crust, which is controlled by the mantle temperature. New crust, addition of new crust from the mantle. So the net growth is the difference between the destruction and the new. So the destruction curve is constructed from the difference of these two. So you can see here that there is a marked leap in the rate of destruction. So this led to the idea that this marked rate of destruction is the start of the plate tectonics, which led to destruction of the oceanic crust below the continental crust. In this part, the continental crust was mafic. So there was less chance of destruction because both the continent and the oceans, they were made up of mafic material. Okay. The other two, there are many other global phenomena which have been cited. I will not go into that. Only two important ones I will say. One is that the xenon isotopic data from the mantle, the xenon isotopic data, xenon is recycled into the mantle from the atmosphere. And the xenon isotopic data from the mantle suggests recycling of the atmospheric xenon into the mantle. It became significant only up to after 3 billion years. Before 3 billion years, the mantle xenon data was almost the primordial xenon isotopic ratio. And from 3 billion years, the atmospheric xenon influence is visible, which indicates that the atmospheric xenon was recycled into mantle. And the other one is paleomagnetic data. This method, which is so important for modern plate tectonics, is difficult to apply to older rocks, primarily because of the difficulty of measuring the magnetic properties of very ancient rocks. But whatever reliable paleomagnetic data could be obtained from older rocks, Archean rocks, it has been found that the paleomagnetic data from the Kampval and Pilbara cratons, they show that there was significant relative movement between the two cratons during the interval of 2780 to 2170. So during this interval, there was relative motion between these two cratons. That would imply that there was lateral motion of the continents, in other words, possible operation of the plate tectonic process. And similarly, relative movements between the superior Kampval and Kolak-Karelia cratons during the time interval of 2700 to 2004 million years. Another interesting information very recently come that the paleomagnetic pole data from 3.18 billion year old basalt from East Pilbara indicates that there was a latitudinal drift for 170 million years preceding 3.18. So for 170 million years before 3.18, this basalt had a latitudinal drift. So the plate tectonics might have been operative at that time. So if we accept that plate tectonics was started to operate on the, or if there is, I am personally inclined to think that we are on solid ground to infer that the plate tectonics was operative from 3 billion years to 2.5. This is the interval in which the plate tectonics started. Now, was it no tectonics earlier than that? No. Earlier than that, there was other types of tectonics which were operative in the earth. These were mostly plume-driven or driven by the heat flow, progressive heat flow from the mantle to the atmosphere. So this is the growth of the earth. Magma ocean, its crystallization, gave rise to the earth that we know it today. Then the earliest stage, there was this individual heat flow, heat loss by individual heat pipes or volcanic conduits, which build up this the first volcanic crust. And then this first volcanic crust cooled, and this cooled volcanic crust, its density was more than the solid mantle at that time, this eclogatic residue. So it started to drip downwards. This is because of the Rayleigh-Taylor instability. And then the lighter high temperature material from the plume. It came up, so this is drips and plumes. And then next stage is upwelling, and this is a cyclic phenomenon. And then we come back to the, after this is complete, we come back to the, again this terminal one, which is a stagnant lead. So this is the sequence which has been suggested by Stern, and this eventually evolved into plate tectonics. This is a slightly more detail about this lead tectonics given by Bedard. Here, this is the mantle plume. It melts here to produce the new melt, and when the new melt, because of this plume, this high temperature, it melts the pre-existing crust to produce the tonalitic magma, and complementary to this, there is eclogitic residue, which is more dense than the mantle. And so at the next stage, this eclogitic residue drips down, and the tonalitic material, this comes up, buoys up upwards to form these granitic domes. And this cycle may be operative several times by the ascent and descent of plumes, so that we can have different generations of granite domes, the later domes reworking the earlier domes. So this is the stagnant lead, which is plume dominated. And this Bedard, again, later publication, they said that how this cycle can be operative more than once. This started with a stagnant lead. This is the oceanic crust with basalt and povetite, symbolically represented by dark and light green, and the continental crust or felsic crust, which is produced by a previous plume episode. So after the plume episode plume died down, this becomes a stagnant part, and then this is the stagnant lead phase of the tectonics. And then the next stage, where there is ascent, the thermal instability causes this ascent of the hot plume from here, and that produces the new domes, the granite domes, and formation of the new granite domes. And I mentioned there earlier that this plume is also accompanied by mantle drag. And this mantle drag, this is indicated by these arrows. So the plume arises here, and there is a compensating mantle flow downwards like that. So this mantle flow can cause the continent to drift and an incipient subduction zone to develop here. Similarly, above the plume head, the mantle drag will be extensional, and the pre-existing continent may be rifted, and a new oceanic crust may be generated. Now this, so conceptually, we can think about a plume-driven tectonics accompanied by subduction and also spreading, but not a global system. This is local related to this plume. And this eventually evolved into a global system. Now this is a conceptual model, just based on geological information and the hypothesis. This has been tested by numerical modeling of the plume. This is a plume. I don't know whether you can see it. This is the plume which is gradually ascending. This is the beginning of the plume. This is 0. From the start of the plume, after 0.7 million years, the scale is also given here, 1200 kilometers to 12 by 1200 kilometers. This is the topography, this is the structure. And this was the old crust, This is the plume head, and this one is the sectional view. This is the three-dimensional view. This one is the sectional view along this. So you can see the plume and the incipient subduction at the two sides. And you can see that as the plume grows, the subduction becomes more prominent. I am not going into the details of how such similar subductions can be produced by meteorites also. They have the same numerical model. That was a sectional and a three-dimensional view. This is a plan view, and this is the top of plume head, above the plume head. You can see that the motion here is defining a ridge system within the plume and a subduction zone peripheral to the plume. So the conclusion, see, it is reasonable to conclude that at the earliest stage after crystallization of magma ocean, the dominant mechanism was stagnant lead, and the tectonics was driven by rising mantle plumes. This evolved to mobile lead tectonics with initiation of subduction at the plume periphery and rifting in the central part. Ultimately, this evolved to global tectonics. But there is still great debate also on this point. One school thinks that the 3.3 billion years where there is a lot of change happening in the geological record, that marks the transition from lid tectonics to the onset of global plate tectonics. The another school thinks that the 3 billion years marks the initiation of subduction in active mobile lid tectonics, but this was a transient phenomenon to be followed by sluggish stagnant and tectonics, and this might have been more than one such cycle till global tectonics took over at a much later date, which has been estimated anything between 1 to 2.8 billion years. There is vigorous debate going on. A lot of this vigorous research also is going on these different aspects of this problem, but the jury is still out and the verdict is awaited. Thank you for listening to my rambling patiently.